All right, get ready, because today we're going deep into something really interesting. It's the idea that buildings can actually speak, that they have like a language all their own.
A language of architecture.
Yeah. We're going to be looking at this academic article today by Martin Donougho. It's called The Language of Architecture. And he has this like really fun thought experiment in it. Imagine, landing on an alien planet and it's just covered with these crazy, intricate buildings, symmetrical and, just wild. How would we even begin to figure out what they mean?
It's such a cool way to think about how we interpret the buildings and stuff we see around us every day, even just the normal places. And Donougho in this article really digs into 6 different ways that buildings can convey meaning.
6. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay, so the first one is kind of the most obvious one. It's what he calls the indexical level. So think of it this way. Buildings can give us clues, just like smoke means there's a fire. They hint at like what they're used for and even something about whoever made them.
Oh, I see. So like if we saw a building and it's got those giant smokestacks and like massive loading docks, we could probably guess it was some kind of factory. Right?
Exactly. It's not like the building is literally yelling, "Hey, I'm a factory,"
Right.
It's more about looking at the clues and then like using your brain to figure out what's going on.
Gotcha.
So that's indexical. But then we go up a level to what Donougho calls exemplification. And this is where the design of the building like directly shows us what it's for. Think of, I don't know, a school that just looks like a school. It's got the classrooms, the playground.
Yeah.
You know what I mean. You know it's a school because of how it looks. We get it right away.
Yeah. It's like those picture books for kids where you match like the tool to the job, right?
Yeah.
Like a stethoscope, that's for a doctor, or a gavel, that's for a judge. So a school building that just screams learning.
Exactly. Okay, so then Donougho's third level, this one is expression. And that's where the building can actually make you feel stuff just by how it looks. So like a really big Gothic cathedral that might make you feel kind of awestruck and like reverent.
Uh-huh.
And then a sleek glass skyscraper that can make you think about like modern times and progress.
I'm already looking at the buildings around me totally differently. So what's next? What's next in this meaning ladder?
Okay, next up is form and decoration. And this one gets into the meanings we see in the patterns and the decorations and like how all the different parts of a building fit together. It's almost like the building is talking to you through like visual language.
Interesting. So like the materials they use, the shapes of the windows, those fancy carvings, it all adds up to a feeling of order and meaning. Like a secret language almost.
You got it. Now, let's get even deeper, the symbolic level. Now, this is where things get really interesting because buildings can be loaded with like straight up symbols and deeper meanings. So think about like those medieval cathedrals with all that crazy iconography, or how Renaissance architecture really shows you how people's thinking was changing back then. Buildings become way more than just something to stand in. They become like statements about a whole culture's values and what they believe in.
Wow. I'm picturing those massive bronze doors on cathedrals with all those scenes from the Bible. Every little detail tells you a story, right? And the whole building becomes like a container for these big ideas. Okay, that's deep. What's the final level? This is like the boss level of meaning.
Right. Okay, yeah. This one's probably the most complex. This is the structuralist level. And this one's about how just the way buildings are arranged and the spaces inside them, how all that can create meaning, especially within like a bigger context. Donougho actually talks about the Boro people in Brazil, and they have this whole village set up, and just changing the layout messed up their entire society.
Oh, so it's like their way of life was like encoded in their buildings. The architecture wasn't just a background. It was like woven into everything they did. That's wild. But all this talk of levels and meanings, I mean, is it really a language like we usually think of it? Like, can buildings actually communicate the same way words do when we talk or write?
That's where things get really interesting. Because while it's easy to use the language comparison, sometimes it just doesn't fit. So let's look at a few ways people have tried to apply like language models to architecture. And you'll see what I mean.
I'm all ears. Let's crack this code.
I think one reason we keep coming back to that language thing is like it helps us understand how a building can be a real thing, but also like mean something at the same time.
Right, like how it can be both.
Exactly. It's just like how language works. You've got sounds or like written letters, but they stand for these big ideas. So architecture, it's concrete, but it's also abstract, if that makes sense.
I get it, yeah. The duality thing, it's both, and that's why we keep going back to that language idea, I think.
Yeah. But like I said, it doesn't always work perfectly. Like, take that logical model of language, the one that's all about, like, making factual statements about the world.
Yeah.
The sky is blue, stuff like that.
Yeah, okay.
Buildings don't really do that.
Yeah, no. A cathedral isn't exactly a science experiment or anything. It's expressing something way different.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the big thinkers who have like really wrestled with this whole architecture as language thing. So there's Nelson Goodman. He said that art, and that includes architecture, it can be seen as a symbol system. But here's the thing, he was mostly talking about architectural plans, the blueprints, not the actual buildings themselves.
Interesting. So he was more into the code, like the system behind it,
Yeah.
than the actual message.
Right, right. And that's a big difference. Then there's Christopher Alexander. He came up with this cool idea of a pattern language for architecture. He thought it could be a way to like design buildings that were both useful and beautiful, like buildings that really understood what people need and how they act.
I like that. But is that really a language, though? Like, literally?
I mean, Alexander was kind of using it more like as a metaphor. He was talking about a set of rules and patterns that could be used to make what he thought was good architecture, not a literal grammar the way we use it for languages.
So Goodman, he's all about the abstract blueprints. And Alexander, he's using language more like a figure of speech. Who else has tried to, like, crack this architectural code?
Well, there's Pierre Boudin, and he tried to actually create a grammar, like a set of rules for well-formed places in architecture and urban planning. He wanted to find like the underlying rules that shape how we design and arrange the spaces we live in.
That's pretty ambitious. Did he succeed?
Not really. His system, it kind of hit a few snags. I mean, for one, it's hard to say what would be wrong, like grammatically wrong in architecture.
Right.
Like if a building was literally impossible to build because of like physics, would that be ungrammatical or just like a bad design?
Yeah, good point. I mean, gravity and stuff, that's a whole different set of rules than grammar.
Totally. And Boudin's system, it kind of mixed up like the physical stuff with how people actually experience a space, which makes it tough to come up with one set of rules that always applies. Oh, and then there's the behaviorist approach, and that's from G.K. Koenig. He thought that buildings communicate kind of like how words work, as stimuli.
Like they trigger us to do something.
Yeah, so like you see stairs, you automatically want to climb them, that kind of thing.
Interesting.
But then you've got Umberto Eco, another big name in semiotics, and he argued that, no, it's not just about instinct. It's about what we've learned about buildings from our culture. That's how we make sense of them.
So it's not just my body reacting to a building, it's my mind interpreting it based on like where I come from and all that.
You got it. And Eco himself, he spent a lot of time trying to find this thing called double articulation in architecture. It's this, it's a fundamental part of language where you take small, meaningful bits and put them together to make bigger, meaningful bits.
So did he find it? Was architecture doing this double articulation thing like language does?
You know what? No, he didn't. He actually gave up on that whole idea. And he said that maybe it makes more sense to see architecture as a bunch of different texts with all these signs and codes instead of as one language with like a clear grammar.
It seems like the harder we try to make architecture fit into that language box, the more it like slips out.
Yeah, that's true. But hey, that doesn't mean the whole language analogy is useless. We can still learn a lot by thinking about architecture in terms of codes and conventions, especially when we talk about architectural style.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more about these codes.
Okay, so think about like the classical orders of columns, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, all that. It's like a set of rules and traditions that architects have been using forever to create different kinds of buildings. And each style has its own meaning and what it makes you think of.
So like learning the grammar of like classical architecture. If I understand those codes, I can start to read the messages hidden in all the different styles.
Exactly. And it's not just styles, it's also the little details in a building that can act like codes. The shape of a window, what it's made of, how the rooms are arranged. They all tell you something.
So it's like learning a whole new language. But instead of words, we're trying to figure out what all those shapes and forms mean.
Right. And just like with any language, there can be different ways to understand it. But there's also this whole debate about whether those architectural signs are actually on purpose or if we're just, like, making stuff up.
So is there a code there, like, intentionally? Or are we just projecting our own meaning onto the building?
Well, Roger Scruton, he said most of the features we see are natural signs. Like, we think they're important, but there's no secret code going on.
So he'd say, like, A high ceiling, that doesn't automatically mean grandeur. We just think because, I don't know, we've seen it that way so many times.
Yeah, that's what he thought. But other people, like Gombrich, they say that the line between natural and intentional, it's not so clear. Once something becomes part of the architectural vocabulary, it starts to have a more deliberate meaning, even if it wasn't planned that way at first.
Gotcha. So even if that high ceiling wasn't meant to mean grandeur, it eventually becomes part of the code.
Right. And then there's Joseph Margolis, who thought Gombrich was mixing up two separate things, like how we take natural stuff and make it into architectural forms, and then how we actually use those forms in a code on purpose.
Okay, so we've got some disagreement about just how intentional these codes really are. But no matter what, there's got to be some kind of system going on, right? I mean, even if I don't always realize it, I'm interpreting those buildings based on, what I've learned and the associations I make.
Absolutely. And understanding those conventions, it really opens up a whole new way to see and appreciate everything around us. But then there's that idea that, art is all about breaking the rules. Does that mess up the whole code analogy?
Good point. I mean, if architecture has all these codes and rules, then how do we explain, all the crazy creative stuff we see architects do? Where do the rule breakers fit in?
Well, Richard Wollheim had some thoughts on that. He argued that applying codes to art is kind of tricky, and architecture is no exception. He said that if we see art as just a bunch of codes, we lose sight of what makes it special,
Yeah.
like the artist's own unique vision and expression.
Right. So is that tension between, needing a system to understand the meaning, but also recognizing that artists can totally break free from those rules?
Yeah. And I think modern and postmodern architecture, those are great examples of how architects can push the boundaries and play with those expectations.
Makes sense. So we've been wrestling with this idea of architecture as a language and looking at all these different ways buildings can convey meaning. But I'm wondering, is there a universal language of architecture that we can all understand?
Hmm.
No matter where we're from or when a building was made? Or do we have to learn a new dialect for every culture and time period?
That is a great question, and it really gets to the core of how we see and experience architecture. I mean, there are definitely some universal things that seem to work across cultures and time. Think about basic shapes, circles, squares, triangles.
Yeah.
Those shapes, they have this primal appeal. They're everywhere in nature, and they've been used in buildings forever, from, I don't know, ancient temples to modern skyscrapers.
So there's something about those shapes that just speaks to us no matter what our background is.
Exactly. And certain ways of arranging space, they seem to evoke the same feelings no matter where you're from. Think about that feeling you get when you walk into a giant cathedral or when you're standing in a huge open space. You know that feeling.
Yeah. It's like the building itself is creating this sense of, I don't know, something bigger than yourself.
Right. It doesn't matter what you believe or where you come from. And even just using light and shadow, that can totally change how you experience a space, make it feel dramatic or mysterious or peaceful. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets really interesting. All those basic elements, they can be combined and played with in so many ways. That's how we get the amazing diversity of architectural styles and expressions we see all over the world.
So it's we all have the same alphabet, but then each culture takes those letters and creates its own language and dialects, right?
That's a fantastic way to put it. And just like with languages, these architectural dialects, they change over time. They reflect new technologies, changing values, even political stuff.
Can you give us some examples of how those architectural dialects are different in different cultures?
Sure. Think about traditional Japanese architecture. It's all about being in harmony with nature. They use natural materials and they have things like sliding doors and open courtyards to make the inside and outside feel like one big space.
So the building is part of the landscape. It blends right in.
Exactly. Now think about Islamic architecture. It's known for its intricate patterns, the geometric stuff, those soaring arches. It's all about creating a sense of sacred space. And they use light and decorations to do that.
Two totally different approaches, and they both reflect different values and ways of looking at the world. It's amazing how these different ways of building create such unique experiences.
It really is. And even within one culture, architectural styles can change like crazy over time.
Yeah.
Just compare a medieval Gothic cathedral with a modern skyscraper. Both are impressive in their own way, but they're speaking totally different architectural languages, right? They show you different technologies, different values, different ideas about what's beautiful.
So it's not enough to just learn the basic grammar of architecture. You got to understand the culture and the history to really get what a building is trying to say.
You got it. And that's what makes studying architecture so cool. It's
Yeah.
a constant process of discovery, you know? You're digging into different cultures and time periods, looking at all these architectural styles, and you're uncovering all these layers of meaning in the buildings around us.
It's like being a detective for buildings,
Yeah.
piecing together all the clues to figure out the story behind each one. So what does all this mean for us just walking around, living our lives, surrounded by buildings?
I think it helps us pay more attention to the world we've built, you know?
Mm.
To look at buildings in a new way and think about what messages they're sending, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
To think about the people who designed them, the people who built them, all the stuff that went into shaping how they look and what they're used for. This whole deep dive has made me really appreciate the buildings around me. I feel like I'm just starting to learn their language. And that's the best part. There's always more to learn, always more to discover. That's the beauty of architecture. We're just scratching the surface of how these buildings shape our world and talk to us, you know?
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the awesome world of architectural meaning. To all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep looking up. You never know what architectural treasures you might find just waiting to be discovered. Until next time on The Deep Dive.